thank the Chinese ambassador for his statement, and je donne la parole au...
I give the floor to the representative of France, Francois. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, my dear Christophe. Allow me to start by hailing, in particular, the participation in this meeting, the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Vice President of the United States. The speakers who I'd like to thank have painted a picture that is absolutely clear. Venezuela has been plunged into the worst humanitarian crisis in its history, with consequences that have been felt throughout the American consequences. And unlike what we are going to hear, there is no so-called foreign plot behind this chaos. The Venezuelan regime is the sole and only culprit of this tragic situation, which has further deteriorated due to the large-scale breakdown of the electric supply system, followed by cutoff in water supplies. The Venezuelan people, unfortunately, haven't seen the worst of it. The increase of all indicators measuring poverty, violence, mortality might only be a prelude to an even deeper crisis unless something is done to ease the suffering of the Venezuelan people and move towards a political and peaceful solution to the situation. That is the issue which should bring us together. This is the following question. How can we reverse the tragic dynamic that has been that we've been witnessing? I will focus on three urgent matters. The first urgent matter is to ensure and facilitate access by humanitarian agencies and non-governmental organizations while fully respecting the principle of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. The outer limits of cruelty seem to constantly be pushed outward when we note that the allies of the regime are ready to divert humanitarian assistance. This kind of use for political purposes of such a situation should be condemned in every case. The position of the Venezuelan regime of denying that there's a humanitarian crisis and restricting access of humanitarian assistance has a cost that can be measured in human lives. I will simply mention the impact on the breakdown of the system of healthcare on the most vulnerable people, and the increase in malnutrition and increase in mortality. Since the position of France has been clear, we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Venezuelan people. France, together with the European Union, has prepared a response that is commensurate to the scale of this crisis. The European Union announced on the 27th of March another 50 million euros of assistance to Venezuela, in addition to the assistance that was already provided. Now, the second urgent matter is to provide assistance to the some 3.5 million Venezuelans who have chosen to take the path of exile due to the chaos and violence. And I welcome the assistance of all the countries of the region. Their solidarity has been exemplary, really. In particular, Colombia, which has shouldered the heaviest burden with some 1.4 million refugees and migrants. And I would like to welcome the presence of the Colombian foreign minister in this room, in this chamber. Such an engagement that has continued really deserves our admiration, even as we observe the continued flow of people leaving the country, some 5,000 people a day, as indicated by the special representative. Unless there's a radical change in the position of the Venezuelan authorities, and unless they fully cooperate with humanitarian agencies, this exodus could further accelerate and have a very negative impact on the stability and development of neighboring countries. And would like to express our solidarity with France with the countries affected. We urge the Venezuelan regime to to seize the opportunity created by the International Contact Group, which has been working hard and with an active participation of France in trying to find a political and humanitarian solution to the crisis. And lastly, the third urgent matter is to begin a political and peaceful transition in Venezuela in the form of a free, credible, and transparent presidential elections under the observation of the international community. Now, as far as answering the question of the causes of this humanitarian crisis, we will no doubt once again hear the Venezuelan authorities accuse foreigners of being behind the tragedy of Venezuelan people. And yet it is, in fact, the Maduro regime which is both the author and the main actor of this tragedy. By wanting to hold on to power, by organizing a mockery of presidential elections, by persecuting the opposition and dissidents, by appropriating the wealth of Venezuela, the current regime has precipitated has pushed an entire country and entire people to the edge of the abyss. Many countries, including France and its European partners, have drawn the necessary conclusions from this situation. The Speaker of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, has become the interim president, not as a result of foreign support, but as based on the Venezuelan constitution and with a view to organize credible and transparent elections. Mr. President, it is unacceptable that the survival of a regime takes place at the expense of the life of its people. We urge the Venezuelan authorities to allow humanitarian assistance reach the Venezuelan people and to take the path of a peaceful, democratic, and lasting solution. The Security Council will need to demonstrate its unity to play the role that it must in this situation. The goal is to promote a negotiated and peaceful solution to the crisis. What must be avoided is the use of force and violence in Venezuela. France in particular wants to stress this point. There can only be a peaceful and political solution, and such a solution requires the organization as soon as possible of democratic presidential elections. While Venezuela today is at the edge of the abyss, our role is not to serve as a substitute to the Venezuelan people. It's quite to the contrary, to allow the Venezuelan people to speak freely and express its wish to decide on its future, and in particular by reestablishing democracy and the rule of law in Venezuela. That, Mr. President, is the essence and the meaning of French efforts in this crisis. Thank you very much. Thank you, Representative of France, for your statement.
The floor to the United Kingdom, Karen.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you to our three briefers, and thank you to the United States for proposing this discussion today, and to Vice President Pence for joining the Security Council. Mr. President, it's clear from the briefings that we heard that the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has reached epic proportions, and it is right that the Security Council should discuss such issues. I know there's an age-old debate that we've never resolved as to how bad does a situation have to get within a country in order for it to constitute the sort of issue that the Security Council has looked at. But the figures that we've heard today and the effect on the Venezuelan people and the effect on their neighbours and the view of the regional authorities and the view of the international authorities as represented by the Special Envoy and as represented by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, I think make it absolutely an issue that this Council should be discussing. Mr. President, we've heard today how ordinary Venezuelans are unable to access food and basic health care, preventable diseases such as measles and diphtheria have reappeared, HIV goes untreated, and maternal and newborn mortality rates are extremely high. Electricity and water shortages, as many speakers have said, have made it all much worse. The figures are appalling, but we're also starting to hear words like unprecedented and unparalleled. And I heard today some things I didn't know, particularly about the health side, so thank you to Dr. Page. And it's truly shocking. The malaria figure particularly stuck in my mind. I think the answer on measles is to refer to the George Washington University study about Russian social media. So I'm not going to go into that there, but I think the malaria figure alone ought to really horrify us. I think it's all the more shocking because, as a number of speakers have said, this crisis is man-made, and all the more so because Venezuela used to be a prosperous country. My understanding of the OECD and World Bank figures, Mr. President, is that Venezuela was considered to be an upper middle income country, so that you can go from that status to having the sorts of problems that we heard described today really does draw the concern of the international community. I wanted also to reference the refugee situation. We've heard the figure, 3.4 million Venezuelans have left their country to go to their neighbours. I too welcome the presence of the Colombian Foreign Minister here today, and we commend him and his government and our Security Council colleague Peru and others in the region that have offered refuge and hope to those millions of ordinary Venezuelans. But we can't rely solely on the region's efforts because, as we also heard today, that number is set to rise quite dramatically. I wanted to thank UNHCR and IOM through the Special Envoy for the efforts they have made. And I think we agree it's a positive first step that the Maduro regime no longer denies the existence of the crisis and that the Red Cross and the UN are allowed to start the international humanitarian response. And the scale of what's needed was set out graphically by the Emergency Relief Coordinator. So I think it just points to how much more needs to be done. For the United Kingdom, we agree with the majority of this Council, Mr. President, for a new start in Venezuela, and we will be working closely with the international community to ensure assistance can reach those most in need. But I wanted to echo what Vice President Pence said in his emphasis on democracy and the rule of law. We stand with the Venezuelan people. This is about what is needed to help the Venezuelan people. So we support the UN's efforts under OCHA's leadership to mount an international humanitarian response commensurate with the severity of the situation and underpinned by the principles of independence, neutrality and impartiality. And I would call Member States' attention to the three areas that the Emergency Relief Coordinator outlined. We call on the Maduro regime, Mr. President, and all actors to facilitate the humanitarian process and to allow further international UN, Red Cross and NGO humanitarian organisations unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to meet the urgent needs of the Venezuelan people. I repeat, it is against international law to try and deny your own people the help that they need, particularly food. I'd also like, Mr. President, to use this occasion to call on Member States to support the UN's efforts. For our part, we have committed a package of nearly $9 million in humanitarian aid to respond to the most severe needs in Venezuela and host countries. We hope that our aid package will respond to the most severe health and nutrition needs by supporting emergency rooms and maternity wards. We hope to help people fleeing their homes have access to critical support, and we hope to help meet the immediate needs of those forced to flee Venezuela who are at greater risk of exploitation. So we plan to offer migrants access to personal documentation and information on how to access basic services. Mr. President, it's important we're clear that the suffering faced by the Venezuelan people is a result of years of mismanagement by the de facto government. Humanitarian aid is urgently needed, but as many speakers have spoken out today, it won't solve the crisis. Political change is equally urgent. The legitimate interim president, Juan Guaido, was stripped of his immunity as Speaker of the National Assembly. His chief of staff was arrested, and others who are trying to secure peace and democracy in Venezuela have suffered similar intimidation and threats. Mr. Guaido has our full support in his efforts to bring about the necessary change. The people of Venezuela deserve a better future, and I repeat, Mr. President, it is our belief that it's time for a new start with free and fair elections in accordance with international democratic standards. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her intervention. Et je donne la parole au...
I now give the floor to the representative of Belgium. Mark, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank the briefers for the information they provided. So as to ensure that the situation does not deteriorate any further, we call all members of the Council to work together in order to promote a peaceful outcome to the crisis. We launch an appeal to make sure that violence is avoided at all costs. In this regard, I would like to voice three messages now. First of all, the importance of full humanitarian access in line with humanitarian principles. The second, the need to launch as soon as possible a peaceful political process which will open the way to free and transparent presidential elections. And third message is an appeal to protect the citizens of Venezuela from all forms of violence. So, first of all, it is obvious that the situation in Venezuela is a humanitarian crisis. We have just heard that described by the briefers. About a quarter of Venezuelans need emergency humanitarian assistance. Amongst the hardest hit are those who have chronic health problems, the pregnant women, children, and the indigenous people. And we need to do everything that we can in order to relieve the suffering of these vulnerable groups. We therefore call on all actors to authorize and facilitate a safe, rapid, and unhindered access to humanitarian supplies into the country. We recall the need to abide by the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence in provision of humanitarian assistance. And we underscore that it's important to ensure that this assistance needs to be provided according to the needs without it being used for political ends. I would like to welcome the efforts made by the United Nations on all of the humanitarian and medical workers in Venezuela, as well as other partners such as the European Union, as was just mentioned by my colleague from France. Secondly, in the absence of a political solution, the humanitarian situation will continue to worsen. And Belgium reiterates its appeal to swiftly launch a peaceful political process, opening the way to free and transparent presidential elections, leading to the reconciliation in Venezuela. As I was already said on several occasions, the presidential elections in May were neither free nor fair nor credible, and they therefore deprived the government of Nicolas Maduro from its democratic legitimacy. We support Juan Guaido in his mission to organize free, fair, and democratic presidential elections. The European Union, together with the countries of the region, have created a contact group which aims in particular to put together the conditions necessary to organize such presidential elections in the near future. And I call upon all of the actors to become fully involved in this initiative. In this context, Belgium is concerned by the information we received, which tells us that there's a growing foreign military assistance to the Maduro regime, the goal of which is far from clear. We plead for a peaceful solution to the situation in Venezuela, and as I said, and the presence of foreign security forces does not contribute towards the attainment to this objective, quite the contrary. My third point, Mr. President, is a call to protect the citizens of Venezuela from all forms of violence. The people of Venezuela have the right to express themselves without fear of political prosecution. Intimidation of the press and the representative of the civil society is unacceptable. We urgently call for full respect for the prerogatives provided for in the Constitution and the immunity of all members of the National Assembly, including its president. Their civil rights, their freedom, their physical integrity have to be respected at all times. They have to be in a position to be able to carry out their tasks without any intimidation. And I would like to conclude, lastly, by thanking the countries of the region for the support they have given to the refugees and migrants from Venezuela, in particular Colombia, represented here by the minister. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie l'ambassadeur.
I thank the ambassador of Belgium.
Word to the ambassador of Equatorial Guinea, Anatolio.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. As our first order of business, we would like to thank all of our briefers this morning at this meeting of the Security Council. The Republic of Equatorial Guinea has been following very closely the evolution of the situation and the roiling tensions in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We deplore the fact that the situation is deteriorating by the day, and we would like to voice our concern that if we continue on the current track, we will end up in a situation that is both unsustainable and undesirable, both for the people of Venezuela, but also for the international community. I would like to make it clear that Equatorial Guinea condemns all acts that might sully or undermine respect for human rights. We believe firmly in the freedom of speech and also that any peaceful demonstration should be respected and allowed to go ahead, as long as, of course, said demonstration is in line with the given laws in the country in which it takes place. President, I would like to reiterate publicly my country's commitment to the Charter of the United Nations and to international law, which clearly and categorically forbid the use of force and instead promote respect for territorial integrity and for the sovereignty of all member states of the United Nations. We share the concern expressed by the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Refugees, to wit that the humanitarian situation in Venezuela is going from bad to worse. Whilst we welcome the timely and impressive display of solidarity shown by countries in the region and the compassionate and noble work of humanitarian organizations that are supporting the dozen countries in the region that are hosting millions of Venezuelans, it is nonetheless crucial that these generous nations continue to keep their borders open and work to reduce the conditions and restrictions imposed upon entry to the country. President, we would like here to pay tribute to the efforts that are being made by Cuba to support many countries, not just in its region, but in other regions of the world, in particular Africa, including my own country, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, in the areas of health, education, etc., a clear demonstration by Cuba of the principles of humanitarian solidarity. President, we are faced with an undeniable crisis of refugees and migrants. 3.5 million Venezuelans have poured out of their country. Given that reality, there needs to be greater mobilization in response on the basis of the Global Compact on Refugees in order to guarantee full support for those who are leaving Venezuela, but also for those countries that are taking them in. We therefore call for all those involved to cooperate and come together to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance, as long as said humanitarian assistance complies with the relevant norms and standards on humanitarian aid, but to cooperate to ensure that said humanitarian aid reaches all those in need without discrimination or distinction. We remain convinced that given that this is a national problem, a national crisis of Venezuela, dialogue and negotiations between national political actors and stakeholders is the best way of ending this crisis. By the same token, it would be fortuitous if the parties involved would sit down together around the same negotiating table, in which international bodies, in particular the United Nations and regional and sub-regional organizations, could serve as impartial and unbiased mediators. We very much welcome the creation of the Montevideo mechanism, the goal of which is to preserve peace in Venezuela on the basis of the principles of non-interference and the peaceful resolution of this conflict. President, we believe that given this tense and turbulent situation, all parties, whether they be directly or indirectly involved, refrain from making statements or engaging in actions that might be interpreted as a threat to use force. This is a way of avoiding riling tensions further, which would only lead to a fresh outbreak of violence, bringing in its wake yet greater suffering and pain. Finally, I would like to reiterate that the crisis in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela should spur all of those involved, both national and international stakeholders, to prioritize the interests of the Venezuelan people over any other personal or factional interest. We therefore urge all political stakeholders to ramp up their efforts to facilitate a peaceful negotiation and to accede to both the good offices of the Secretary General as a way of finding a peaceful solution to the dispute, as well as calling upon them to accede to the involvement of the organs and agencies of the United Nations and of regional and sub-regional organizations to help bring about an effective and long-term agreement that will contribute to strengthening the political, economic and social fabric of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Thank you very much.
I thank the Ambassador of Equatorial Guinea for his intervention, and I give the floor to the Ambassador of Kuwait, Mansour.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for participating in today's meeting, and I would also like to thank the Vice President of the United States of America, Mr. Mike Pence. And I would like to thank all briefers for their briefings. Mr. President, we are confronted with a warring humanitarian crisis whose implications may go beyond Venezuela and neighboring countries if not addressed urgently. There is no doubt that such a situation will have negative repercussions on regional stability and security, and it will then be difficult to contain its security, political and economic implications. We are concerned at the humanitarian situation. The people of Venezuela are struggling with a severe shortage in food, medicine, water and electricity, all of which are major life necessities, which reflect a grave economic situation and an unprecedented inflation. All of these factors have led to great movement and displacement over the past years, the majority of which are children and women. Such displacement has placed great pressure, economic and political pressures, on neighboring countries and on their ability to provide refuge and food to these displaced people. 3.5 million Venezuelans have left to more than 15 neighboring countries. 7 million Venezuelans are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, according to OCHA reports, and as we heard from Mr. Lowcock in his briefing. Therefore, we urge the Venezuelan government to open the border crossings to allow humanitarian assistance, including food and medicine, and allowing access to the largest number of people in need, in line with international standards. Mr. President, we call once again on all Venezuelan parties to refrain from any inflammatory measures, provocative measures, and to prioritize the national interest of Venezuela in order to preserve its security, stability, and unity, and in line with the aspirations of the Venezuelan people. We call on them to launch a comprehensive and inclusive dialogue to stem the bloodshed and to preserve the dignity of the Venezuelan people, to address the root causes of the crisis, and to spare Venezuela and the countries of the region further violence and instability. We commend all countries that are seeking a peaceful solution to the crisis. In closing, the State of Kuwait expresses its commitment to the principles of the Charter including respect for countries and non-interference in their internal affairs, according to the Article 2 of the Charter. Thank you.
I thank the Ambassador of Kuwait, Mansour, for the declaration. I now give the floor to South Africa, Jerry.
Mr. President, my delegation wished to recognize the presence of the Secretary General, CDC, Antonio Guterres, and earlier on, Mr. Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States of America. We would like to thank all the briefers, especially you, Mr. McLaucock, and your excellent staff in Venezuela. Please pass our utmost gratitude and appreciation for the sterling job they are doing in Venezuela as they discharged and offer much needed assistance to people of Venezuela in the midst of uncertainty and political contestation. Mr. President, international solidarity is a hallmark of most of us in developing countries, including Cuba. The situation in Venezuela requires a constructive and united Security Council in addressing both humanitarian and political situation facing the country. The political situation in Venezuela and continued economic difficulties in that country is a result of myriad of factors, including conflicting geopolitical dynamics. This necessitates the Council's focus on resulting humanitarian situation in Venezuela and its adverse impact on ordinary people. In this regard, I wish to reiterate South Africa's position on three issues. Firstly, the provision of humanitarian assistance must be provided in accordance with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and in full compliance with the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1446/182. These principles have enabled the Council to act in other difficult situations in order to support the people in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. This should be the central approach of this Council on this matter. And that's why we totally agree with the UN Secretary General in the respect. The Council should not politicize the humanitarian assistance in Venezuela. Secondly, it is important that the effective and unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance takes place in coordination and cooperation with the Venezuelan government, acknowledging the fundamental principles of state sovereignty as reflected in the UN Charter. It is therefore necessary to acknowledge and work with established structures in Venezuela so as not to create parallel structures that may also cause increased tension in that country. Third and finally, Mr. President, the provision of humanitarian assistance should be based on an adequate and accurate needs, as Mr. Lokok was saying, of the situation in order to match these needs with appropriate support and steer away totally from the possibility of humanitarian intervention being used as a pretext for increased tension, including possibility of military intervention. Mr. President, South Africa therefore urges all parties to respect the need for impartiality, neutrality, and independence in the provision of humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. We also call on the international community to support the channeling of humanitarian assistance through the UN agencies. And we are very grateful, Mr. Lowcock, to say you have increased the capacity of personnel to over 400. We hope we can see more in Venezuela and more such UN presence in the neighboring countries. But also, we should do so through other recognized international organizations such as the ICRC in order to promote the much-needed neutrality and impartiality for provision of humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. I thank you. I know I'm going to speak on time. Thank you very much.
Jerry, no comment. I give the floor to the Ambassador of Indonesia. Gianni, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, permit me to, like others, thank the briefer of today. I will focus my intervention to address 3 points related to the humanitarian situation. I think that is supposed to be our main focus of today. First is the deteriorating humanitarian situation, which we have been following closely. We are deeply concerned of it. We heard the briefings that the people of Venezuela is experiencing many difficulties. This cannot and must not be ignored. The fact also shows that there are millions of refugees crossing the border, affecting neighboring countries, which should also be addressed. We thank those countries that have received the refugees. We fully support United Nations efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to alleviate the hardship experienced by the people of Venezuela, and of course support the work of the UN OCHA thus far. I have taken note of the 3 areas that deem the Council attention as duly presented by USG Mark Lofcourt. Thank you very much, Mark, for that. Mr. President, I believe many countries in this room care about the plight of the Venezuelan people and have the best of intention. But the best of intention is not enough. And therefore, if they have the best of intention, it should not matter how assistance is being delivered, and thus should be channeled their assistance to the UN system, which is impartial and gain the trust of the Venezuelan people. What is most important is that assistance reach those that are really in need, which is the people of Venezuela. This is the time for the United Nations to once again play the crucial role of not only good officers, but also a good guardian of humanity by coordinating the delivery of international assistance. The United Nations have the mandate and expertise, as stated in its charter, I quote, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian characters, unquote. We urge that any delivery of assistance by any parties is guided by the General Assembly Resolution of 46/182 and the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Many has alluded to these points. Such assistance must be free from political objective, and it should be delivered on the basis of need, in close coordination with the Venezuelan government, and in full respect of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Certainly, it is also necessary to create conditions that will enable the successful provision of humanitarian assistance to the people in need. We appreciate the granting of full access to humanitarian personnel in Venezuela. Humanitarian assistance should also be provided to refugees in neighboring countries. That brings me to my second point, which is the need for dialogue. Indonesia reiterates that dialogue is the key that will significantly enable best conditions for the smooth flow of humanitarian aid. Indeed, to resolve the broader situation in Venezuela, we would once again urge all parties to prioritize dialogue and accept the Secretary General good offices to help resolve the crisis. In this regard, we encourage countries that have an influence on the parties to also play a positive role. Indonesia has always believed that there has to be a negotiated solution based on dialogue among all those involved, including the options set forth in Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. Third, the Security Council as a whole must do everything it can to not impede but open up avenues that result in constructively and peacefully resolving the ongoing situation. The Security Council has met 3 times to discuss the situation in Venezuela, yet it has so far failed to make any differences for the country. Once again, another sad day for the Council. Based on the principle of the UN Charter, the Council must discharge its responsibility by assisting Venezuela to stabilize itself back to normalcy. It should work in unity. The humanitarian challenge that resulted from economic and political difficulties cannot be met unless the Council resolves to rise above its differences. Borrowing the Indonesian national motto, I quote, "Unity in diversity." Although the Council might be diverse in its view, it should be, or I should say, must be united in its action for the greater good of humanity. Let us show to the people of Venezuela that the Security Council can and will be united. Let us show that we care, that we will not leave them in despair and hopelessness. Mr. President, I am reminded of what Dag Hammarskjöld said. I quote, "The United Nations wasn't created to take mankind into paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell." I quote. Indonesia implores the Security Council to act with unity and determination to be on the right side of history, the side of peace for Venezuela. And I would like to echo the call of ESG Mark Lovecourt once again for us to separate humanitarian with political objective. Now is not the time for naming and shaming. Focus on saving life. Focus on the many niñas and niños, children of Venezuela, so they have a better future. I must say, after my last statement in this council, I got a call from an ordinary people in Caracas, not only in thanking us for the statement, but also reminding us all here in the council to put aside our differences and think about all the peoples of Venezuela. We have opened the curtain in the Security Council, so let us open our heart and bring light to Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Ambassador of Indonesia for his statement. I give the floor now to Poland, Mariusz.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank the briefers for the very valuable and informative contributions to today's discussion. Our briefers' interventions have clearly demonstrated to all of us the gravity of a humanitarian situation that needs to be addressed in an urgent way to help the people of Venezuela. So there is no doubt that the people of Venezuela are facing the dire humanitarian crisis. And this is a man-made crisis. The crisis resulted from corruption and mismanagement. Furthermore, the crisis and suffering of the people of Venezuela are only further deteriorated by the refusal by the de facto regime of Nicolas Maduro to grant access to the country of a so desperately needed humanitarian aid. The reality on the ground speaks for itself. Health sector is in absolute collapse. The shortages of food and medicine are regular, not sporadic. Widespread malnutrition of children, increasing infant and maternal mortality, researches on infectious disease for long considered eradicated, should not happen in a country that has all the necessary natural and human resources to flourish and should lead statistically in every socioeconomic category. And what makes the case worse, the government is not only unable to resolve these issues, but it also contributes to deepening the crisis by denying the scale of the crisis and casting aside aid offers. And let me thank also Kathleen Page for Johns Hopkins report, and we find these findings very, very troubling. Mr. President, the current humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has particularly alarming effect on women and girls, the most vulnerable groups. as in case in the most of conflicts and crises. Trafficking of women for sex and forced labor is increasing throughout the region. Moreover, women in Venezuela are facing further challenges and risks, including a rise in sexual and gender-based violence, shortages of feminine items, and high levels of maternal mortality. Much remains to be done to address the extremely urgent needs, and Venezuelan actors across the political spectrum have a responsibility to put the interests of Venezuelan people at the center of the actions at this critical time. But it is up to the de facto regime to acknowledge the problem first and allow large-scale humanitarian assistance into Venezuela. As we speak, more and more people, 5,000 every day, are crossing the borders, joining more than 3 million Venezuelans that have already fled the country and leaving behind those unwilling or unable to live despite being forced to live in extremely miserable conditions. The Council cannot remain idle in face of such crisis which has an adverse effect on the peace and security in the region. We appreciate the efforts of the Latin American countries in order to provide assistance and maintain an open door and to provide assistance to refugees. A friend in need is a friend in indeed, and we really commend both the government but also the people of Peru, the people of Colombia, represented today by the foreign minister, and Ecuador, and all neighboring countries for the real hospitality for the people of Venezuela. Mr. President, while trying to focus on the humanitarian aspect of this briefing, we cannot refer to the political background of the Venezuelan crisis, and in this regard, two key issues to be addressed are the rule of law and legitimacy. Given the multifaceted challenges ahead and current lack of political dialogue, Poland considers the National Assembly as the only power in Venezuela that represents a democratic mandate obtained in a free, fair, and credible elections. The National Assembly and its president, Juan Guaido, should be heard and should be respected. Once again, we repeat the call for the full respect of his constitutionally mandated prerogatives and immunity of all members of the National Assembly, including of its president. We further appeal for respect for democracy, rule of law, and fundamental freedoms and human rights, including the freedom of assembly, and we call to refrain from violence. Mr. President, the main challenge in the political track of this crisis is to guarantee with all international support the peaceful character of the transition process. We are convinced that the solution to the multidimensional crisis affecting Venezuela can only be a political, democratic, and peaceful one, and the restoration of democracy is possible through free, transparent, and credible presidential elections. We support both the EU initiatives and the Lima Group efforts to find the way out of this acute crisis, which is above all political, with severe economic and humanitarian consequences to the people of Venezuela. And we need to do our utmost to alleviate the most urgent humanitarian needs and to reduce human suffering. We have to support Venezuelans in their hopes for decent life in a democratic and prosperous country. The time is pressing and we can't stay indifferent. And finally, Mr. President, we urge Venezuelan de facto regime to respect and fully protect freedom of media, including safety and security of journalists. We strongly condemn cases of violent attacks and intimidation against both foreign and domestic journalists. Of all such cases should be investigated in a thorough and independent manner. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for his intervention, and je donne la parole.
I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to also welcome the participation in this meeting of ours of the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Vice President of the United States. We also thank the speakers who took the floor, thank them for their briefings on the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. Mr. President, Cote d'Ivoire follows with special attention the way the situation in Venezuela is developing, and we note with regret that there is an institutional political impasse throughout the country. This political tension seriously impacts the economic situation, which is already difficult, and also further compounds the humanitarian crisis, which is characterized by deteriorating health and food situations, and the consequences of that in the sub-region are tangible. All in all, according to humanitarian agencies, 7 million Venezuelans, about 1/4 of the population, who need food and health care. 3.4 million of them have sought refuge in neighboring countries. Mr. President, the humanitarian emergency in Venezuela calls upon this council to become greatly involved in considering this in order to provide the response to the needs of the millions of people in need, and to do this in line with the principles of international humanitarian law. In this regard, my delegation is of the view that because of its leadership and its major expertise in humanitarian matters, the United Nations has to play a primary role here in order to mobilize its specialized agencies and to coordinate the assistance extended by the international community. Therefore, it is necessary to establish a close cooperation and a synergy of actions between the authorities in Venezuela, the specialized agencies of the United Nations, and all of the international partners, so as to mobilize the means needed to cover the needs and to ensure that there is a safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to the populations in need. We would like to recall for all the parties that they are under obligation to uphold human rights and international humanitarian law. We welcome the authorization extended to the Red Cross to distribute emergency assistance, and would like to thank the neighboring countries for their solidarity as regards the Venezuelan people. To conclude, Mr. President, I would like to say that we want to reiterate our constant position where we plead for a peaceful solution to this crisis. We therefore urge once again all of the parties to become involved in frank negotiations in order to find the end to this crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Equatorial Guinea for Cote d'Ivoire for his intervention, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Germany. First, let me pick up where our colleague from Indonesia ended when he said that this is a sad day for the Council. I don't share that view. I think that the discussion today, which we as the presidency wanted to have concentrated on the humanitarian situation, I'm optimistic that from this meeting we will have a situation where more will be done on the humanitarian front. So, with regard to this, I also would like to ask to thank the three briefers for their very impressive statements. Actually, our Russian colleagues called into question the basis for your findings. Maybe afterwards you can still give a bit of indication on the basis of your findings. And again, on our Russian colleague, he compared the situation with regard to the measles in New York and in Venezuela. There's one big difference. If parents here want to vaccine their kids, they can go into a pharmacy and get the vaccine. If you try to get vaccine in a pharmacy in Caracas, you don't find it. And in this context, I would also like to again pick up what one of our colleagues said and our Belgian colleague said with regard to arms. And there I would also like to express the view that what Venezuela needs least in this moment is the supply of military weapons. What they need right now is a supply of humanitarian aid, of medical assistance. So I would also, in the light of what our Indonesian colleague has said, I would like to appeal to our Venezuelan colleague that he recognize the dimension of the humanitarian crisis that his country is facing. that he allows all humanitarian actors to work in his country. They need access and they should be able to assist. And the principles, as our French colleague has reminded us, the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality and independence should govern the humanitarian aid. Again, we are, as others, alarmed about the politicization of the humanitarian issues. This runs counter the humanitarian mandate. Many have also alluded to the massive exodus of Venezuelans from their country. As almost everybody around the table, let me also express my solidarity, Germany's solidarity with the neighbors, and pay respect to what Peru, what Ecuador, what Colombia is doing, and pay tribute also to our to the foreign minister of Colombia. Also like to commend the countries in the region that they try to coordinate their efforts in response to this humanitarian crisis. This is the biggest refugee crisis Latin America has seen in its history. Very briefly on the political solution, we need a peaceful political process. All actors have to show restraint, refrain from the use of force, respect human rights. We are in favor of free, transparent, credible presidential elections organized under the leadership of the interim president, Juan Guaido. The EU is ready to help also through its international contact group. Again, the conclusion of this meeting for me is we must not leave the Venezuelan people alone. Thank you very much. And I now take again my hat as chair, and I give the floor to the Russian Federation has asked for the floor. Dimitri.
Very briefly, Christoph, just to introduce clarity in the issue of vaccinations, I just wanted to say that the government of Venezuela was ready to buy vaccines, but the money was stolen from it, as we said, the money that had been deposited in the British and American banks. So the situation is simple here. First, you create a problem, then you suggest that it be solved. Just to clarify things. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to give the floor to the ambassador from the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, I know you don't want to prolong this, and I don't want to get into a tit for tat, but the money was not stolen from a British bank. It's very important that we correct these falsehoods. Thank you.
I thank the ambassador from United Kingdom for her intervention, and I give the floor now to the ambassador representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. To begin, I think it is incumbent upon us to respond to a broad range of lies and false information that we heard from the mouth of the Vice President of the United States here. We're supposed to be here discussing the humanitarian situation, but I think we need to respond to what he said so we can clarify things before the international community, before the people of Venezuela, before the media. He lied in saying that yesterday the region as a whole rejected the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in the Organization of American States. That is false. That is a lie. It is misinformation, a problem that perhaps he needs to address with his legal team. Yesterday, what happened in their thirst to promote a coup d'etat in Venezuela and impose a puppet government to uphold their interests, the U.S. interests in Venezuela, which would allow for the pillaging of our resources, then they ran roughshod over the founding charter of the OAS, which is commensurate with the Charter of the United Nations. And they twisted the law to such an extent that what was approved was not the expulsion of the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the OAS. Rather, they approved and adopted the inclusion of a representative of the National Assembly of Venezuela. And this is absurd. It's a legal fiction, what happened yesterday, because the OAS, just like the United Nations, is an organization of states. It is not an organization bringing together national assemblies. And the only state present representing us in this organization is the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Thus, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela was not expelled from the OAS. What we have instead in the OAS is a strange individual. Nobody understands what he's doing there, what he will be doing there, because he doesn't represent the state of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He represents the National Assembly. It's important to understand that. So what was said was a lie. Why do I flag this here? Because this is just part of the machinery of lies which is intended to sell the course of action of the United States to the members of the United Nations. What they're seeking to do is impose a puppet government, and they want to convince the United Nations of the rightness of their actions. They want to see the United Nations as the club of friends, the backyard of the United States. They have to subordinate the United Nations to their interest, to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine being a racist policy that was set up 200 years ago by a slaving state, and which runs roughshod over international law. It has no basis in international law. There's no basis in international law for what the United States is doing. We are sure when the United States attempted to pull the wool over the eyes of the attempts here in the United Nations to play the same trick as it played in the Organization of American States, pulling the wool over the eyes of those present, it will fail here. We certainly hope it will fail here. It is threatened with war. It has threatened us with war as well. All options are on the table. On what legal basis are all options on the table? On what legal basis can one country threaten another with war here around this room? This is something else the United Nations should address. Now turning to the topic that brings us together here, President. The humanitarian situation in Venezuela does need to be resolved. But if we err in the diagnosis, then we will also be mistaken in the treatment that we give that's intended to bring succor to Venezuela. The situation, as has been said here, is the fruit of human action. But what everyone has tiptoed around here in the room, including the three briefers who are very smart, intelligent people, they're able to draw together data, analyze that data, including Mr. Stein, who's a very wise man, but they shut their eyes to what the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela wants to share with them. But they will hear, for example, the dictator government in Guatemala. That has been done by Mr. Stein and his team, but yet they refuse to meet with us to hear what we have to say. But as I was saying, none of the three briefers and none of the members of the Security Council acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is that the actions that have led to the humanitarian suffering that we're seeing in Venezuela are the direct fruit of a plan of economic destruction put together by the government of the United States and the United Kingdom with the goal of strangling our national economy, thus triggering the maximum degree of social suffering, eroding the capacity of our nation for self-sufficiency and to respond to said suffering. And when all is said and done, the intention here is to provoke a social implosion that they can then use as a pretext for foreign military intervention, hiding behind the perverse notion of the responsibility to protect that has been the pretext wielded for colonial invasions of those countries that have oil reserves. This is a mind-boggling, inhumane experiment in unconventional warfare. It's a policy of calculated cruelty, violating en masse human rights, going so far, I would say, as to being equivalent to committing crimes against humanity. And all of this is done with the goal of justifying the pillaging and looting, to justify the imposing of a subordinate and puppet local government, and in our particular case, hiding behind a racist ideology, the Monroe Doctrine. People might think that we're exaggerating, but you only need to hear the words themselves of these criminals. This is not what I had to say. This is what has been said by these criminals by the United States. On the 9th of January 2018, spokespersons of the Department of State affirmed that the campaign of pressure targeting Venezuela is working. And what we are seeing is a complete economic collapse in Venezuela. In other words, our policy is working, our strategy is working, and we will stay the course with this policy and with this strategy, end of quote. In October of last year, Ambassador William Brownfield of the United States said, and here I quote directly, "We need to treat this as suffering, tragedy, agony that will continue until it reaches its endpoint. And if we can do anything to speed up this process of tragedy and agony, then we should do it, understanding that this will have an impact on millions of people who are already having difficulties daily in finding food and medicine. We cannot pursue this course of action and pretend that it will have no impact whatsoever. We have to take a hard and harsh decision. The end justifies the means of this severe punishment. These are not diplomatic words. These are not the words of a humanitarian agent. This is inhumane. This is cruel. These are the words justifying an international crime, a determination and a willingness to punish the entire Venezuelan people. Senator Marco Rubio, who supported the coup d'etat in Venezuela, stated that over the next few weeks, Venezuela will go through a period of suffering that no other country in the Western Hemisphere has ever suffered in modern history. And on the 22nd of March 2019, John Bolton, of infamous memory and ignominy in this organization, said that this is like Star Wars. This is similar to when Darth Vader strangled someone, snuffed their life out. This is what we're doing economically to Venezuela. I'm not inventing any of this. You can go back and check. These are their words. This is deliberate economic destruction. It's the systematic application of the policy of aggression with the use of financial instruments wielded against us and undue pressure. They have used their dominant position in the markets to influence the banking sector, private businesses, and other nations that engage in legal business and exchange and trade with Venezuela, including agencies of the United Nations who have also suffered extortion wielded by the United States. And all of this is to isolate our country from the trade systems and international financial systems of this planet. If it was true that the Venezuelan government, as has been affirmed here so many times as part of a litany of lies, if it was true that the Venezuelan government, as has been claimed erroneously, is killing its own people, then why is this group of countries doing all it can on such a mass scale to increase the suffering? Why would there be the need if we're already responsible for the suffering of our people? This gives the truth to the lie. It is them who are responsible for the suffering of our people. It is them who are seeking social breakdown to justify their invasion. It is a plan in which banks, insurance companies, and indeed the tools of trade such as boats and shipping systems are used with a destructive capacity comparable to weapons of mass destruction, but without those responsible for this suffering being taken before the courts to suffer the moral sanction that they deserve. John Bolton said in January of this year, "My advice to bankers, businessmen and other traders is not to trade in gold, oil or other Venezuelan products." Whilst on the 29th of March 2019, Elliot Abraham said, "We're imposing our sanctions." This is what he said directly. We, the United States, are imposing our sanctions. And what is the regime doing in response? The regime is trying to find ways to sidestep said sanctions, to seek out new clients, to seek new markets for imports. So what do we do in response? We observe very closely, and we can see boats on the ocean moving, and we can see contracts being signed with new companies. And the minute we detect such action, we speak with the shipping companies, with the transport companies, with the refineries, with the governments, and we tell them you should not be doing this. This is what we are doing. That's what Mr. Abrahams was saying. He who is depicted here as an angel, an agent of humanity and humanitarian action. This reprehensible act is a criminal policy of mass destruction, and it goes hand in hand with the looting and pillaging that has cost our nation so many millions of dollars. At the same time as they're depriving our people of essential goods, leading to huge levels of suffering, they are with the left hand robbing our Venezuelan people of thousands of millions, if not billions of dollars. The profits of our refineries are being used to pay the debts of oil companies that are friendly to the government of Trump. His friends hold Venezuelan debt, and they're receiving special licenses to pursue profits with money stolen from our people. That's what they're lining their pockets with. That's what they're profiteering from. They have announced a plan to lead into debt my country which has led to a debt of $70 billion. And this money is used to pay uncertified debts that are allegedly the fruit of shadowy financial negotiation, but nobody can prove the amount of these debts which this money is allegedly being used to pay off. We cannot forget the fact that the Bank of England, which robbed our people of $1.2 billion in gold with the excuse that they did not recognize the president of Nicolas Maduro and they will continue the sanctions of Trump. And then we hear the representative of the United Kingdom talking about the fact that they took this step to avoid money laundering, which is just ridiculous. That gold has been in the Bank of England for 30 years now, with nobody raising concerns about money laundering whatsoever. They are working together with the puppet government and saying that they are complying with the sanctions of the United States and with the order of the British government to recognise the puppet government. The credibility of the Bank of England as a neutral and impartial organisation has been ruined. Their reputation is as naught. All they're doing is supporting the government of Trump. The colonialist policies of Trump are building on their own colonialist history and their own history of piracy, which they pursued for at least the last 200 years. This is the real cause of the plight of Venezuelan people. There is no other reason for it. Our people are suffering, and our government too, as can be testified to by the Secretary General, who's working closely and hard with the United Nations system to boost the number of cooperation projects as well as the volume and capacity of these programs, particularly in the healthcare sector as well as the sectors of food, education, electricity and transport. There can be no doubt, President, if you were better informed in Venezuela, you would know that vaccines are available in Venezuela, and our coverage of vaccinations for malaria and measles, for example, and to be able to stamp out these diseases has improved markedly thanks to our partnership with organizations such as the World Health Organization. People are being deceived. Their vaccines are available in Venezuela, and our healthcare coverage, including the delivery of vaccines, has improved remarkably over the last few years. All of that is measurable. The same is happening with our cooperation with the ICRC, the president of whom met yesterday in Caracas with our head of state, Nicolas Maduro, to make progress in the founding of a direct mechanism that would facilitate genuinely neutral, impartial and independent assistance. And the same can be said of friendly countries who stand ready to provide assistance on a peaceful basis and fully respecting our sovereignty in so doing. One key factor that has been underestimated by those who are waging war against Venezuela is the sheer strength of our national spirit, which only increases when we are faced with difficulties. This macabre experiment in destruction and bringing to its knees a nations is seeking to prove that economic crimes do work for these nefarious ends, that people will eventually break and that they will cede to the oppressive foreign power. Nonetheless, in Venezuela, they have miscalculated. The collective suffering caused is resisted by growing levels of organization and determination in our people. Our Bolivarian national armed forces have not broken and are more united than ever. Our workers are reacting to the attacks on our infrastructure with a discipline that the aggressors are unfamiliar with and cannot boast of for themselves. There are problems that we have to deal with, but they are not there are problems, there are some instances of aggression and violence, but they are not aimed at civil war. And this will not be the end game for all that those who are bringing this pressure to bear on us would like it to be the case. Our people is setting an example to the world of how to resist in peace. It might be logical to think that the efforts of our government to overcome the difficulties caused by this aggression would in fact be recognized, applauded and supported by the international community, who claim to be so interested in alleviating suffering. Rather, what we're seeing is a fresh wave of economic extortion, which is cutting off financial flows to our country and from our country to abroad, and is also affecting our cooperation with the very agencies of the United Nations, who, as I speak, are unable to find a way to receive funding and money and to send the necessary goods and supplies to meet the needs of our people. And do you know why that is the case? It is because the government of Trump is engaged in a campaign of terror against commercial and financial agents who have anything to do with Venezuelan money. We are not asking for handouts or for anybody's money. We have our own money, but the government of Trump terrorizes economic actors, traders, and international agencies so that they won't actually touch the money that we're willing to offer to pay for the services they can provide. What the United States is interested in, and has been interested in thus far, is not humanitarian aid, but rather a covert operation without the consent of Venezuela, violating our territorial integrity, with a constant threat of the use of force, as we heard again today, and openly inciting a military uprising and civil war. That's the speciality of this government of Mr. Abrahams. President, this Security Council bears the responsibility, according to Articles 24, 34, and 39 of the Charter, a responsibility to maintain and uphold international peace and security, and to identify the existence of threats to peace, and also to identify and respond to acts of aggression. And thus we would solicit, we would demand, that we request that you identify and determine the following. Firstly, what is the legal basis allowing the United States and the United Kingdom to apply to Venezuela a program of economic destruction without the express consent of this Security Council? They're enacting measures covered in Article 41 of the Charter, including an economic blockade, without the authorization and consent of the Security Council. When the Security Council reached that finding that these two nations, the United States and the United Kingdom, are acting without the consent of the Security Council and without the covering of the Charter. My second question to you: what legal authority does the United States have to sanction, to imply secondary sanctions to countries that trade legally with Venezuela? Thirdly, the Security Council needs to determine what is the legal basis allowing the United States to threaten Venezuela with the use of military force. Where is this legal basis to be found? Why has there been no statement made in response to what is clearly being done by the United States, such clear threats? Fourth, I would ask the Security Council to determine what is the legal authority allowing the United States and the United Kingdom to appropriate our wealth. We're supposed to thank them for their offer of $9 million to address the humanitarian situation in Venezuela, when the Bank of England stole $1.2 billion of our money. The Bank of England is supposed to be an independent organisation. We hear from the Bank of England themselves that we are obeying the government of the United Kingdom, despite their alleged independent status. As I was saying, my fourth question to you, that you as the Security Council need to determine: what is the legal authority used by the United States and the United Kingdom to appropriate our wealth, obtaining profit therefrom with a mass violation of the human rights of our people? Fifth, what is the legal basis allowing the United States to intervene in affairs that are strictly the preserve of the internal preserve of the Venezuelan people and Venezuelan government in a flagrant violation of Article 2.7 of the Charter? To conclude, the diagnosis of the current situation, President, is that it is clearly and blatantly the result of a campaign of aggression meted out by the United States and the United Kingdom. The treatment for this suffering cannot be a fresh dose of aggressive intervention hiding behind a humanitarian facade. The solution is not in donations from criminals who want to present themselves or set themselves up as saviors. The treatment for Venezuela is not in humanitarian channels designed to provoke and trigger armed conflict, or in donor conferences that hide what's actually going on, the looting and pillaging of the resources of our nation. The treatment, rather, lies in returning the money which has been stolen to Venezuela, in lifting the commercial and financial blockade on our people, in ceasing the sabotage of our infrastructure in clandestine operations, in ceasing the threats of military intervention, and in ceasing to threaten those Venezuelans who want to engage in dialogue. We must stop this war of Donald Trump, and this Security Council must live up to its responsibility and live up to its mandate, guaranteeing that Venezuela can enjoy its right to peace. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic for his statement. The representative of the United Kingdom has asked for the floor to make a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I apologise for taking the floor again, but I can't allow those allegations against the Bank of England to go unaddressed. I reject completely the allegations made by the Venezuela ambassador. He's made them before. I wrote to the then president of the Security Council, the Equatorial Guinea PR, on the 21st of February, rejecting the allegations. I will have that letter circulated again, and we'll put it on our website. But for the benefit of the record, Bank of England's reputation is world-renowned. It operates to the highest standards. It has operational independence from the British government. Thank you.
I thank the representative of UK for her statement, and the representative of Peru has asked for the floor to make a further statement. Gustavo.
Thank you very much, President. I promise I'll be succinct. I do not think it is worth responding to someone who does not represent a country duly. It is beneath our dignity to respond to the representative of an illegitimate government. I think what we want to underscore is a point that has been referred to by many people, and that is the plight of Venezuelan refugees and migrants, which was not dealt with in the statement we just heard, and which is very important and very serious. Many countries in the region are making Herculean efforts. Peru is home to some 750,000 migrants who we're supporting with our own resources. A little more than a month ago, I flagged this point to the representative of Mr. Maduro, and he wasn't able to respond to me. And so I'd like to ask him today, why didn't he refer to the serious plight of the hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans that they're suffering today? Today we heard, to our great surprise, the frivolous way in which the representative of Mr. Maduro said that the situation in Venezuela was normal. This reflects what we heard about a month ago when we addressed this in the Security Council again. We were told that everyone was happy, everyone was preparing for carnival, etc. Today, what we heard additionally is that the situation is the result of sanctions and outside action. As I said in my statement, the serious humanitarian and economic crisis that we're seeing in Venezuela is the direct result of domestic action. For years in Peru and in other nations, we have been seeing growing flows, growing outpourings from Venezuela of people. That's been the case for years. So we cannot accept this theory, which is intended to deceive world public opinion as to the roots of a crisis. The roots of this crisis are to be found in Venezuela itself. They are not the result of foreign meddling. Thank you very much, President.
Thank the representative of Peru for his statement. The representative of Venezuela has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thank you, President. First and foremost, on the Bank of England, we will circulate to all the members of the United Nations and to the public at large the truth on this situation. The Bank of England is not independent. And letters of correspondence confirm that. Letters sent to our representatives in which they say black on white that they are following the sanctions applied by the government of the United States. This proves that the Bank of England is not independent. Also proof of its lack of independence is its willingness to communicate with opponents of the government of Venezuela imposed by the United States. It engages in communication with those representatives. The Bank of England has no prestige. Given what it's doing with us, it also did with Libya in the past. The Bank of England simply seizes any opportunity available to it when a country is weak, and it swings in the wind. The most recent example is that the government of the United Kingdom states that their traditional policy is to recognize states and not governments, and that this will not change. In the case of Venezuela, they did change that policy, and now they say they don't recognize our state, but they recognize a puppet government, which doesn't control even a single street in Venezuela, and the Bank of England has swung into line behind this policy. And the president of the Central Bank of Venezuela, whom they've dealt with for years, they now say that they don't recognize him because the government of the United Kingdom has changed its opinion. This is not an independent bank. We need to tread carefully if you believe that that is the case, because you're entering into dangerous waters. In response to the ambassador of Peru, I think it's worth recalling to him that the United Nations is not the book club of the United States under Peru, and that Peru's individual decision to recognize a nation or not to recognize a government or not has no impact on my status here in the United Nations. My legitimacy depends on the legitimacy of my government as recognized by the United Nations. It is not dependent on declarations by the Ambassador of Peru or the Vice President of the United States. To feel that you have the power in your hands to expel from the United Nations your friends, your enemies rather, those that you don't like, simply indicates to me that you don't understand the Charter of the United Nations and the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So I sound a warning bell once again that there is a clear move here again to undermine our rights. And if they can undermine our rights, they can undermine the rights of all members of this organization. So we must tread carefully and reject this. On migrants and refugees, we cannot deny that this is happening in Venezuela. But the root cause of this is economic. But I do think it's ridiculous that we use the word refugees. Because when you talk about refugees, you usually mean somebody who is suffering from political pressure or political persecution, has to flee a country for that reason and is unable to come back. That is not the case with Venezuela. People leave Venezuela and people come back to Venezuela freely, and this happens day after day. There are instances of people going abroad for numbers up to 30,000 to work abroad, but they come back the same evening. So they're not refugees, they're simply working abroad. The Ambassador of Peru is suggesting that we treat as a security problem economic refugees or economic migrants. If that is the case, then he has to explain the situation of what is happening with the economic refugees on the border of the United States that are being treated as a humanitarian crisis, a security crisis by the government of President Donald Trump by building a wall, by sending the army to the border with Mexico. This should have been addressed by the Ambassador of Peru if he really felt that migrants and refugees should be treated with the dignity that he claims that they should be. But this is not being said by the Ambassador of Peru, which I think is further proof that Venezuela is being treated as a unique case and the ground is being laid for an invasion. That is why I come back to my own statement, call upon you to exercise your duty of indicating and determining whether there is a legal basis for the action being taken against Venezuela and Venezuela alone. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of Venezuela for his statement. As the briefers have been addressed during the discussions, I would like to give him an opportunity to take the floor. And I first ask Mark Lowcock if he wants to say something.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. You asked me a question about the basis on which we are assessing humanitarian need in Venezuela. And I'm happy, if the Security Council wishes, to provide a written explanation of how we do this. But in summary, in the interest of time, as I said in my statement, the work we've done so far has been on the basis of all of the available data. We have, in the best way we're able to in Venezuela, applied our tried and tested methodology that we use all over the world to assess humanitarian need. We've applied our standard system for caveating and quality controlling the use of the data and the judgments we make on the data. And again, as I said earlier, we are keen to sustain the consultations we have with the government and with others, because the only basis for principled humanitarian action as the situation evolves is a serious and professional ongoing effort to assess humanitarian need. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Lowcock, for his statement. I give the floor to Mr. Eduardo Stein if he wants to comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will only refer to two things: the legitimacy of the data, which we have carefully picked based on the immigration data of legal crossings in the bordering governmental installation of the migration authorities of the receiving countries. And of course, the hardest hit is the Colombian territory. But if we were to include the varied video recordings of irregular footpaths or blind trails or unofficial border points, which are also daily used by the different numbers of unrecorded Venezuelans crossing irregularly, the numbers would go well above 4 million mark. And as you know, irregularity increases vulnerability, but we have chosen not to include these irregular numbers of blind crossings. Secondly, I just would like, with all due respect, to set the record straight about what was said by the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in the Security Council today. I was officially invited by his administration last year, and on November 16, I personally met with Foreign Minister Arriaza, and I never, ever resisted or gave any indication of not willing to go to Caracas to attend the invitation. The only request I expressed was for an agenda of the visit. In other words, what were they inviting me for, insofar as I must remember to the member states of the Security Council, our mandate is basically humanitarian to attend those people who have left the Venezuelan territory. But in any case, Foreign Minister Arriaza agreed that they would send a proposed agenda for my visit, which I am still waiting for. Thank you.
Mr. Eduardo Stein for his statement, and I give the floor to Ms. Kathleen Page.
So the question regarding the data, as I mentioned, we did some site visits. We spoke to workers within and outside the Venezuela, and also reviewed publicly published data by the Pan American Health Organization and the WHO. Further details about our methodology is published in the peer-reviewed Lancet article that came out 2 weeks ago, for those who are interested in reviewing this. I also want to highlight that we did obtain official data when we could, and we, just to highlight one point, as I mentioned, the childhood mortality and maternal mortality has increased from 2015 to 2016 pretty significantly. That data comes from official reports from the Venezuelan Ministry of Health, and that decline preceded the economic sanctions that have been mentioned. Thank you.
I thank also Ms. Page for her statement. The representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has asked for the floor, and I give you the floor.
I hope this will be the last time I have to weigh in, President. Thank you very much for giving me the floor once again. Once again, to make it very clear to Mr. Stein that we have a letter signed by him himself when he says that he cannot come to Venezuela despite our invitation because his mandate does not allow him so to do. And for this reason, we lodged a formal complaint with the Secretary General. We have a document, a letter, that proves that he doesn't want to meet with us. That's why I raised the point in my statement. I did so correctly. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.